Well, hello there, internets. This is Scott from Crescent Soil Services. We had some questions in the comments of some recent YouTube videos of a request to go over some more soil balancing information. So I wanted to pull together some information from the soil balancing class that I teach to go over some concepts that pretty much every situation we work in runs into. So here we go. So this is a slide deck that comes from our soil balancing class, which the next session and the last session for 2024 starts this coming Friday, October 28th. I guess it'd be next Friday. But anyways, here's a live example we're going to walk you through that I talk about in the class. So what we're looking at here is 4 sets of soils. Now these can be 4 beds. These can be 4 market garden rows. They could be 4 1-acre plots. It doesn't really matter. Just kind of go along with the concept that we're looking at 4 different samples. And this first one here is green. And I've color-coded these to our biological standards, and green means good and within the desirable minimums for a good outcome. So right here we've got sample 2 that is good and it's within those desirable ranges. Sample 1 and sample 3 are orange, which usually means it's below the desirable standards. So we've got 2 of our 4 samples here that are going to be below the desired numbers and the targets on the soil test. Now, number 4 here is color-coded red, which either means dangerously high or dangerously low. And in this example, we're going to keep it as dangerously low. And this is really common. It doesn't matter if you buy 4 bags of soil or you farm on 4 acres of land, there's going to be some natural variation in those soils that will need to be addressed in order to have the performance that you're after as a commercial farm, or even a hobbyist for that matter. So let's take a look here now in a different visual representation. And this is easily one of the biggest problems we run into in our professional consulting work is the issue of variation of soil chemistry causing other problems. And in this case, we're talking about how variations in mineral chemistry are not going to get the same net result from an equal effort of fertilization. So sample 2 that has the desirable minimums and balance on the Logan test is going to provide an appropriate outcome when you put fertilizer inputs into that soil. Now, because number 1 and number 3 are below those desirable minimums, you're not going to get the same productivity from the same input of fertilization. And then even worse, number 4 is going to be well low compared to samples 1, 2, and 3. So, like I said, we are going to get the appropriate plant growth response, the appropriate yield, and the appropriate productive capacity with the input of fertilization that we're providing here. But samples 1 and 3, which are below those desirable minimums, in my work experience, we tend to see somewhere between a 20 to 50% reduction in yield in those samples that are just below the desirable minimum values. Now, in sample 4, we're just going to simply describe it as where the bugs and the disaster are going to come from. So most farmers that have farmed for any length of a time have a section of their farm or several sections of their farms that are just perpetually a problem. Most often, there's an underlying mineral chemistry dysfunction, imbalance, or toxicity that's causing that problem, right? So where it starts to really unravel really badly for you as a farmer is the decisions for our pest and disease managements are driven by this poorest performing sample on the farm. I've yet to professionally advise a farm, maybe a couple times, but we'll just say by and large, very rarely does a farmer walk into their cultivation space and see a small pocket of dysfunction or problems and only treat that section. Most farmers come at it from a fear-based mindset, very reactionary, afraid that they're going to have wider spread problems if they don't aggressively deal with it at this point. What nobody ever wants to talk about is that in my entire professional career, I've never seen a product that's used to control pests or disease increase productivity and increase yield. One of these books behind me here is the yellow one somewhere in here, is Healthy Crops from Francois Chaboseau, which a lot of you in the regenerative community are familiar with that. It's an entire booklet talking about all the problems that start to unravel once you start to try and control chemically for pests and disease. So basically what's going to happen is a farmer's going to come in on Monday morning. They're going to see a section of their farm that's maybe starting to get an infestation of pests. Maybe it's starting to get some powdery mildew proliferation. They're going to then usually make a widespread application to all fields, all plants, even if they don't need it now. So if we would have left these plants alone, or rather left these samples of these soil sets alone and just fertilized them normally, there probably would have been little to no problems in zone 2 because it maintains those desirable balance and targets of mineral chemistry. Now, you'd probably get a little bit of light problems in 1 and 3. Maybe you just get a reduction in productivity. Now, like I said, this is where everything's going to unravel. So I've yet to see any sort of control product for pests and disease increase productivity. So even if sample 2 would have been just fine, the simple act of spraying for pests and disease is going to reduce those outputs. So hopefully you can see an illustration here of the importance of managing mineral chemistry from a variation standpoint, which is easily one of the biggest problems we run into. So the first goal that we teach in the soil balancing class is to equalize all groups. In my professional consulting experience, making the mineral chemistry of all sample sets very similar to each other from a balance and from a mineral content tends to magically reveal 30 to 40% increase in productivity. In our cannabis work, it also brings about a 30 to 40% increase in quality. So that increases your market value. And, depending on what the goal of your brand is, if your goal, your brand is to produce higher quality, getting all samples and all plants in that facility to perform at the same quality is going to improve the perception of the quality of the produce or crops that you produce. Now, our second goal is going to be to improve all those groups. So just again, first goal is bring everything up to a similar cohesive balance, aiming for similar targets and aiming for a similar balance for the Albrecht method of base saturation. Once we've achieved that goal, that will improve things on the farm significantly. And then we're going to raise all ships. And it's pretty common in our consulting work that this results in an actual doubling of yield. So we're going to first make everything look like each other. We're going to make everything consistent. And hopefully you took from this presentation that what's going to come from that is you are going to get a similar production capacity and capability from the input of fertilization you give. So when we have a sample set that's well below the desirable minimums for mineral chemistry or out of balance, you're not going to get the output from that input. So you can start to go down a whole rabbit hole of the economics of that. But from a simple standpoint, let's just talk about one factor that most people are after, which is yield, because yield is what you sell, right? So, hope that's good. What's up, Sammy? Sammy is a student in our, whoa, didn't set that up before I started. That's too funny. Sammy is one of our most active students, and I can always count on him to show up. So thanks for coming, Sammy. All right, so now we're going to go over some soil tests. So this came from a project that we've been working on, and this is, we're looking at Logan Labs soil test reports. And in my professional experience, the Logan Lab test provides the farmer the most actionable data. Now, there's some other people in the industry that might disagree with that. All my work experience says if you want to improve on-farm productivity, this is the test you should focus on. So what we're looking at here, this was with a soil manufacturing client, and we're looking at different bag soils that are readily available in most regions of the world, or at least the United States. And so we've got A1 and A2. These are the same product, just multiple bags. We're first investigating variation of the product. B1, B2, same thing. So those are two bags from a different label. Let me zoom in a little bit here and make these numbers bigger for you. And just real quick glance, I don't want to overwhelm you with what these numbers mean, but let's just start really simply. One of the first things I look at is total exchange capacity, which can be loosely defined as the size of the gas tank. In my experience, you really want to be above a 10 to a 15. So this A1 and A2 is probably not going to return the productivity and yield that you're after. Neither is B1 or B2. For sake of simplicity, let's just look at one section of this data. So this is the base saturation, which is the foundation of this Mehlich 3 test. What we're talking about is the relative balance between calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium, which is what determines everything about soil structure, the characteristics, to a certain degree, the availability of mineral nutrients in that soil, the porosity in that soil, the ability of water to infiltrate that soil, and the ability of oxygen to infiltrate that soil. So this balance can tell you a lot about what's going to happen from a productivity standpoint. And at this point in my career, I've done so many thousands of Mehlich 3 recommendations. If you just show me one of these, I can usually tell you what problems you're going to run into. It's pretty common patterns, at least from a general essence. So good old Dr. Albrecht felt we should have somewhere around 68%. So this is a potting soil. So I'd actually like to see this more like 70, 71, 72. Magnesium somewhere between 10 and 14. And potassium, I try to never go over 7% and try to keep it above 4%. So if you look at these, we are well below 68%. And if you really dive into Dr. Albrecht's work, he cautions even falling below 65 or 60. It's not a linear progression. It's pretty exponential in its problems. So in my experience, once you drop below 60%, things start to unravel quite rapidly. So here at 49%, most plants are going to struggle to grow properly. And if you put on top of that 26% of potassium, this is basically going to be a bug fest. So if 80% of that plant needs to be built with calcium, and you're well below the standard of availability for that, and you're, what is this, 5 times the goal, 5, 6, 4, 8, whatever, it's a crap load more than we want, you're basically going to create a plant that has weak watery cells. You're going to have a hard time getting calcium into that plant. You're going to have cells rupturing from an excess of potassium. You're likely to have root-borne pathogens. Almost certain going to have some sort of fungal powdery mildew, bud rot type thing. Just to put it clearly, if you go to the store and you purchase these soils, you're going to be convinced that you are no good as a farmer. But really, basically what happens on these numbers, if you take the university standard for chemical agriculture and turn it into a potting soil, this is what you get. So if you were to create a hydroponic nutrient solution with equal parts calcium and potassium, it'd probably be pretty good for the vegetative state. So this is the problem where we start bringing chemical mindsets into soil-based systems. It starts to be pretty problematic. Now we can look at the bulk density, so that's the weight of the soil, and we can compare that across these samples to see consistency. So we're actually pretty consistent from a soil weight. So whatever they are making, it's at least coming off the assembly line consistently. And what I did was we went to stores and we tried to grab bags off completely different pallets, one off the top, one in the middle, one that looked a little bit older and faded, to try and give us an example or some sort of view into the consistency capabilities of these various manufacturers. So again, we've got a couple more bags here. So C1, this is a different product, and D1 was a different product. So this C1 actually has a substantial amount of mineral content, but it's not necessarily desirable. So D1 is another commonly found bag soil product, we'll say. And this is a test batch, so what we call a mock mix. So whenever I'm entering into that soil making world, when we're trying to formulate a new potting soil, so in this case we're talking about potting soil, but this applies to everything. In this case with potting soil, what you're looking at here is simply a combination of the peat moss, the compost, and the aeration. There's no minerals added to it. And we're doing this so that we can get an understanding of what's going to happen when we combine our available materials into potting soil configuration, so that we can have an idea first, is this a suitable combination? Is this a suitable compost to use in this situation? And from there, we can clearly calculate how many minerals and what type of minerals need to be added to that soil in order to bring about desirable balance. So interestingly enough, just mixing together peat moss, compost, and aeration got us right into what I would define as the minimums. Well, for those of you paying attention and know these numbers, yeah, we could use a little sulfur and phosphorus, but we're not trying to add minerals here yet. So here we go again. So we're in what Albrecht would describe as catastrophically low calcium levels. And when you combine that with very high magnesium levels, well, that's a yield and a quality killer in pretty much any crop I've worked with. And this soil is going to be very tight and constricted. So these calcium and magnesium minerals in the soil are going to have, pushing and pulling forces on each other. So from what I understand, calcium has a pushing away force, and magnesium wants to pull in those soil particles. So we get into like flocculation or stacking or compaction. So even though these are potting soil samples, this soil is likely to not take water infiltration very well. It's absolutely going to be low in oxygen, and you're probably going to have some pretty good plant health problems. So starting out the gate. Now, like I said, in a potting soil, I'd prefer to see more like 70, 72%. We are a little bit high on the magnesium, and we are a little bit high on the potassium, but keep in mind, that's with 0 minerals added. So we have yet to put minerals into the soil. A little bit of high calcium lime, a little bit of gypsum, some soft rock phosphate, and this is pretty much perfect from a mineral chemistry standpoint. So now we can look at the saturated paste test. So, the chemical agricultural world really wants to impose on the organic farming community that the saturated paste test is what we should focus on. And every bit of my work experience says that's not really what you want to do. The short answer of what happens when you focus on the saturated paste test in organic systems, at least in my experience coming in after crop loss and catastrophic plant health problems, what we find is you very easily wander into an over-fertilization, very dysfunctional base saturation balance. And so very quickly you can take a soil that might have been good, focus primarily on the saturated paste test, and end up with very excessive levels of nitrogen. That's the most common denominator there for those people that are focusing on the saturated paste test. And then it's quite easy to radically disrupt the base saturation, which is what that Malic 3 is primarily focusing on, and the basis of that information is with the balance or the base saturation. So now, if you're farming at very large scales, it's probably not practical to bring in 35 truckloads of gypsum. So I'm not necessarily talking about those largest scales of agriculture, because in the largest scales of agriculture, it's not very practical to spread minerals across the soil. And ultimately, they fall into a category of use synthetic fertilizers. And then, now you are focusing on solubility. But when you compare the results of a properly balanced soil to the Malic 3, and always incorporating biology on this channel. So if you're balancing to the Malic 3 and you're incorporating biology, in my experience, there isn't anything that meets those productivity yields. I don't care how much you foliar feed. I don't care how much you love the saturated paste test. In every single side-by-side trial we've done or clients secretly put us through, focusing on the Malic 3, adding biology pretty handily whoops the butt out of the saturated paste. So that's kind of my little 2 cents on that, and let's break down these numbers. So again, we got A1, A2, B1, B2. First thing that kind of jumps out to me is this chloride is quite high. That's usually the indication of, poor quality compost inputs, and pretty substantial levels of phosphorus. But again, these are products aimed at, people that want to grow flowers with blue fertilizers. So that's probably what they're expecting, but not really what I'd want. So down here, we've got the percent, which this is a different test. So they use different terminology, but for all intents and purposes, this is the same concept of the balance of calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. So on this test, we're maybe looking for somewhere between 60 and 65 for calcium, somewhere around 20 for magnesium, somewhere in the teens for potassium. So, these looked bad on the Malic 3. They look, pretty atrocious over here on the saturated paste test because it's all soluble. So basically, this one's upside down. We're basically looking at a reversal of what's needed from a calcium standpoint and a potassium standpoint. Now, again, if you're growing some sort of like potted flower, like you might be able to get through. any sort of agricultural crop, this is going to be a hot mess. And ultimately, end of the day, you're going to think that you're not good at farming or don't have a green thumb. Really, you just were set up for failure. I mean, these are some of the lowest calcium-based saturations I've seen on any test, and these are high. So, this is a substantial amount of soluble potassium, and basically it's upside down, right? So what are the consequences of that? In the absence of calcium, the plant is going to replace it with potassium, which is an electrolyte, which will fill up the cells and it will allow the plant to continue its life cycle. But an electrolyte is going to draw water into the cell through osmosis, and it's going to cause a rupturing. So the real simple answer is you're going to have weak watery cells that are pretty prone to pest and disease issues. It's not good. Again, root-borne pathogens. So now again, okay, so I just talked bad about chloride, and we got some decent high chloride here on the client one. So we're going to have to look at the quality of our peat moss and our coco coir, maybe examine a little bit more intensely what went into that compost, try to diagnose that. But if everything else is good, you could probably get by all right. Now, coming to the base saturation, these, again, here's another one that's completely upside down, completely backwards. This is not desirable either. Now, we've got some ways to go here, but keep in mind, we haven't added any minerals. So this is pretty easy to fix with a little bit of micronized limestone. That's going to put these numbers back into balance. You bump that number back up to 100. We'll probably be in the high 50s, and this will still be a little bit high, but it will still lead to a really affordable large-scale potting mix, which is what we're after. So in that context, now we're not trying to save the world on everything. That what we're looking for with that product we're producing is an affordable, large bulk volume, in the hundreds or thousands of cubic yards. So it's hard to have it absolutely perfect. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you're able to get some sort of benefit from these videos. If there's something more specifically you would like to know or would like to learn about, drop it in the comments and I'll circle back around. I'll be honest, we haven't been all that active on YouTube lately. We've been putting all of our focus into our master classes. That's really where I prefer to spend my time. I can speak freely, I can speak open and honestly, and I don't have to worry about being censored or booed off stage. I can just say what needs to be said to the students, and I'm really, really enjoying that format. So the soil balancing, the final session for 2024 starts next Friday, October 25th, and so you go to our website. I'll put a link in the description and click apply. It's got all the information, and you can apply to the masterclass. Everybody that joins the soil balancing class gets access to the calculator tool that we created. So this is a set of tools that allows you to do the calculations, to amend your own soils. And then we've added some analytical tools that allow you to look at your soil test in a much deeper, more analytical fashion. So we're having some pretty good fun with that. And then also, we just produced a composting masterclass. I have been completely tied up producing videos. I'll be here till 1 o'clock in the morning again tonight, putting together content for our masterclass. So my wife, Sarah, is teaching what we call the BioBox method of composting, which is a combination of what we learned working very intimately with Dr. Lane Ingham. So we incorporate aspects from her thermal composting style. We incorporate worm composting techniques, and then we've taken the best aspects of the Johnson-Su bioreactor, which is a great evolution, but there's some significant obstacles and problems with the Johnson-Su method. And so we've kind of merged all these techniques together into something that's very forgiving, very easy to execute, and it's a lot easier to manage. So again, I'll put the links to these master classes in the description. I do apologize, we haven't been on YouTube very much lately. We have just been so consumed with our master classes and putting together a nice teaching lesson there and the interaction that goes there. So yeah, again, circle back around, drop some questions, some specific things that you'd like to hear about. When I get some free time here in the next month or two, I'll start putting together some more YouTube content. And if you want to know about soil balancing, jump in the masterclass next Friday. Thanks for joining.